Let me tell you something about lying. Everyone does it. The research on everyday deception, Bella DePaulo's landmark diary, studies on lying in everyday life, found that the average person tells 1 to 2 lies per day. White lies, social lubricant, the polite fiction that keeps the social world running smoothly. That is not what this video is about. This is about something categorically different, something that the clinical psychology literature distinguishes carefully from ordinary deception, and that most people who have encountered it in a relationship, in a family, in a professional context, know immediately is not the same thing at all. The compulsive liar, the person whose relationship with truth is so fundamentally disrupted that deception is not a strategy they deploy when necessary. It is the default, the baseline, the first response rather than the last resort. The person who lies when the truth would serve them just as well. Who lies about things that do not matter? Who lies so consistently and so automatically that the people around them eventually cannot identify a reliable boundary between what is real and what is constructed? The psychology of this is not simple. It is not just about dishonesty. It is about a specific and complex psychological configuration with identifiable neurological foundations, identifiable developmental origins, identifiable functions that the clinical literature has been mapping with increasing precision, and understanding it is one of the most important things you can do if you have ever been close to someone who operates this way. Let's start with the clinical distinctions, because compulsive lying is not a single thing, and the failure to distinguish between its different expressions is the source of most of the confusion in both the popular and the clinical conversation about it. The first distinction is between compulsive lying and pathological lying, terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but that the clinical literature treats as distinct. Compulsive lying refers to a pattern of lying that feels driven, automatic, not fully under conscious control. The compulsive liar often reports that the lie arrives before the conscious decision to lie has been made, that it emerges before they have evaluated whether lying is even necessary or advantageous. Pathological lying, sometimes called pseudologia fantastica in the clinical literature, a term introduced by Anton Delbruck in 1891, refers to a more elaborate and often more grandiose pattern. The pathological liar does not just default to minor deception. They construct, they build elaborate false narratives, claim accomplishments, experiences, and identities that are entirely or substantially fabricated, and often appear to partially believe the constructions they have created. The second distinction is between lying as a primary feature and lying as a secondary symptom. In some clinical presentations, most significantly narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder, compulsive deception is a feature of the broader personality structure rather than the primary problem. The lying serves specific functions within the personality architecture, functions that make sense when you understand the psychology they are embedded in. In other presentations, what some researchers identify as habitual or compulsive lying as a standalone pattern, the deception is more primary, more automatic, less clearly serving specific strategic goals. The distinction matters because the treatment implications are different, and because understanding which pattern you are dealing with changes how the deception needs to be understood. Here is the neuroscience. Because the biological foundations of compulsive deception are among the least publicly discussed and most clinically important aspects of the research. Yang's neuroimaging research, published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2005, one of the first studies to directly examine the neural architecture of pathological liars, found significant structural differences between the brains of habitual liars and those of control subjects. Specifically, the research found increased prefrontal white matter and decreased prefrontal gray matter in the pathological liar group. The significance of this finding is in what prefrontal white matter does. White matter facilitates communication between brain regions. More white matter in the prefrontal cortex means more efficient connectivity between the executive regions and the rest of the brain. The interpretation the researchers offered is counterintuitive and important. Most people assume that lying requires more cognitive effort than truth-telling, that the truth is the default and deception requires an additional step. The neural architecture of habitual liars suggests the opposite may be true for this population. Their brains are structurally configured to facilitate the rapid, automatic generation and deployment of deception in ways that neurotypical brains are not. For the habitual liar, lying is not cognitively expensive. The neural infrastructure has been built through a combination of genetic predisposition and developmental experience to make deception the path of least resistance rather than the deliberate departure from a default of honesty. This does not mean compulsive liars have no agency. It means the automatic pull toward deception in their psychology is neurologically grounded in a way that the moral failure framing completely misses. Here is the developmental picture, because understanding where this pattern comes from is the most important piece for making sense of why it develops in the people it develops in. The research on the developmental origins of compulsive lying consistently identifies early relational environments as the primary shaping influence, and the specific environments that appear most consistently in the developmental histories of compulsive liars share a common feature: environments where the truth was dangerous, not in the abstract sense, in the specific, practical sense of environments where expressing the truth about emotional states, about experiences, about what was actually happening, produced negative consequences, where honesty was punished directly, where the emotional weather of the household required the child to conceal, to manage, to present a version of reality that was safe rather than accurate. Research on the relationship between childhood abuse, neglect, and deception patterns in adulthood, and the broader literature on the adaptive functions of deception in high-threat environments, finds a consistent pattern. The child who learns that honesty is unsafe learns to lie, not as a moral failing, as a survival strategy, as the most intelligent adaptation available to a developing mind in an environment where the truth reliably produces harm. And as we have discussed in multiple previous scripts in this series, the adaptations built in childhood do not simply switch off when the conditions that produce them no longer apply. The automatic deception that protected a child in an unsafe environment continues running as the default in the adult who grew up there, even when the adult environment is genuinely safe, even when honesty would serve them better. The nervous system that learned lying was safer than truth does not update that learning easily or quickly. Here is the piece that most people who have been close to a compulsive liar find most difficult to understand, and the one that the psychology research illuminates most usefully: the function of the lying. Because compulsive lying is not primarily about gaining advantage through deception in the way that strategic lying is. The compulsive liar frequently lies about things where the deception produces no obvious benefit, where the truth would have been perfectly acceptable, where the lie creates complications that honesty would have avoided. This is the behavior that baffles the people around them most completely. Why lie about that? There was nothing at stake. The truth would have been fine. The research on the function of compulsive deception identifies several psychological mechanisms operating beneath the apparently irrational pattern. The first is self-protection. Even when the objective stakes are low, even when the truth would produce no negative consequence, the compulsive liar's nervous system has been conditioned to treat disclosure as threat. The automatic deception is not a rational assessment of the current risk of honesty. It is the conditioned response of a system that learned to treat exposure as dangerous. The second is identity management. The compulsive liar's relationship with their own identity is frequently fragile. The lies are not just about external facts. They are about the self-concept, about maintaining a version of themselves, more capable, more experienced, more admirable, more whatever the situation seems to require, that the genuine self feels insufficient to present. The shame underneath compulsive lying is one of the most consistent clinical findings in this area, not the shame of being caught lying, the prior shame that the lying is protecting, the deeply held belief that the genuine self, unembellished, unmanaged, honest, is not enough, would not be accepted, would be found wanting. Let me talk about the specific patterns that the research identifies as most recognizable in the behavior of compulsive liars. Because recognition, honest, calibrated, research-informed recognition, is the most practically valuable thing this kind of understanding can produce. The first pattern is what the clinical literature calls lie escalation. The compulsive liar who has told a lie and been partially questioned on it does not typically retract. They elaborate, build, Add detail that makes the original lie more plausible and simultaneously makes the web more complex and more fragile. Each new detail creates the need for further detail to maintain consistency. The architecture of deception grows until its weight becomes unsustainable. The second pattern is the detection paradox. Compulsive liars are frequently skilled at detecting the moment when they are not believed, at reading the social signals that their deception is not landing, and at rapidly adjusting the narrative. But this skill does not produce what most people assume it produces. It does not produce a return to honesty. It produces a more sophisticated deception, a revised version that better addresses the specific doubt that was detected. The third pattern is what researchers call leakage in the specific context of motivated deception. Paul Ekman's research on microexpressions, brief, involuntary facial expressions that reveal concealed emotional states, finds that deception, even in skilled liars, produces leakage. Not always visible, not always legible to untrained observers, but present. The emotional reality that the deception is concealing produces physiological responses that the conscious management of the deceptive performance does not fully control. The fourth pattern, and the one with the most significant relational consequences, is what clinicians describe as the reality distortion field. The person in sustained relationship with a compulsive liar gradually loses their reliable anchor to what is actually true about the shared reality. Their own perception becomes contaminated by the accumulated deceptions. They begin to doubt their own memory, their own interpretation of events, their own reliable access to what actually happened, but producing the same psychological damage to the person on the receiving end, regardless of the liar's intention. Here is the clinical picture of what happens in the interior world of the compulsive liar, because this is the piece that the moral framing most completely obscures. The research on affect and deception in compulsive liars is not what most people expect. The assumption is that the compulsive liar is comfortable with their deception, that the lying is easy because they are unbothered by it, that the absence of visible guilt or remorse reflects the absence of genuine distress about the pattern. The clinical picture is more complicated. They are aware of the gap between the version of themselves they present and the genuine self they conceal. They experience the concealment as exhausting. They want genuine connection, but find that genuine connection requires a level of honest self-disclosure that feels existentially threatening. The lying is not chosen because it feels better. It is chosen automatically, compulsively, without the conscious evaluation that would allow a different choice. Because it feels safer. Because the conditioned response that developed in an environment where honesty was dangerous is still running, still treating disclosure as the greater risk even when the evidence of the current environment says otherwise. This is not an excuse. The damage that compulsive deception does to the people in relationship with it is real and serious and does not become less serious because the liar is also suffering. But it is an explanation. And explanations are the beginning of understanding, which is the only foundation on which anything genuinely changes. Here is what the research says about change, because the question of whether compulsive lying patterns can be genuinely altered is the most practically important question for anyone dealing with this either in themselves or in someone they care about, which means there is no defined treatment protocol the way there is for depression or OCD. What the broader clinical literature suggests is that the most effective approaches are those that address the underlying psychological structure rather than the lying behavior directly, where the compulsive lying is embedded in a trauma history, where it developed as an adaptive response to an environment where honesty was unsafe. Trauma-focused therapeutic approaches that address the underlying threat conditioning are the most relevant. Building the genuine experience of safety that allows honesty to feel possible. Developing the self-concept that does not require the elaboration and management that the false self demands. The research on change in deeply embedded behavioral patterns is consistent on one point. Addressing the behavior without addressing the function it serves produces compliance, rather than genuine change. The compulsive liar who stops lying because the social consequences have become too severe without the underlying psychological work has not changed the pattern. They have suppressed it, and suppressed patterns, the research finds, are patterns waiting for conditions where suppression is no longer sufficient. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of compulsive lying is not a story about bad people who choose to deceive. It is a story about a specific psychological pattern with neurological foundations, developmental origins, and psychological functions that produces sustained deception as an automatic response to a conditioned experience of the world as a place where honesty is dangerous. That does not make the behavior acceptable. The damage it does to relationships, to trust, to the people who are on the receiving end of sustained deception is real. It does not become less real because the person producing it is also trapped in it. But it does change the question from why would they do this to me to what is this pattern doing for them? What is it protecting? What did it develop in response to? What would have to be different, internally, psychologically, neurologically, for honesty to feel as safe as deception currently does? And for the compulsive liar themselves, if they have the self-awareness to recognize the pattern, it provides the beginning of the map toward the genuine self that the deception has been protecting and protecting from all along.